He'd disappear for hours into the library, pulling down manuscripts that most popes never looked at. Texts about theology, about authority, about whether the things the church taught were actually true. But the most noticeable change came around month 5. The women arrived. At first it was just one, a pilgrim who travelled to Rome to see the Holy Father. She was brought to his chambers late one evening. By morning she was gone. Guards escorted her out, probably gave her some money, probably told her to keep quiet. She would go back to wherever she came from, carrying knowledge of something she couldn't speak about, carrying shame that she knew on some level wasn't hers. Then another pilgrim came, then another, then another. Within weeks, there was a steady stream of women being led into the papal quarters. They came for different reasons. Some were pilgrims who'd saved for years to make the journey to Rome, who'd prayed every day that they might see the Holy Father, who'd been told by priests that it would be the greatest spiritual experience of their lives. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Some were daughters of noble families, girls whose parents had brought them to Rome, hoping that being noticed by the Pope might improve their marriage prospects or the family standing. Parents who, if they thought about what might happen to their daughters in the papal chambers, didn't allow themselves to fully contemplate it. Some were serving girls who worked in the palace, girls who had no powerful family to protect them, girls who couldn't refuse, girls who understood very clearly that if the Pope wanted them, they went because what were they going to do? Say no to God's representative on earth. The chronicler Lutrand of Cremona was there. He lived in Rome. He witnessed this. He wrote about it with barely concealed horror. He said, John transformed the Lateran Palace into what he called the worst brothel in Rome. But brothel is inadequate. Brothel are businesses. Women who work in brothel are there for payment. And while that dynamic carries its own problems, it's different from what was happening in the papal palace. This was something else. This was the systematic use of absolute power to gain access to women's bodies. This was a teenager who had been given God-like power, discovering that God-like power has no limits. And once you discover that limits don't apply to you, stopping becomes almost impossible. The women couldn't refuse John. He was the Pope. He spoke for God. If he wanted you in his chambers, you went. If he wanted you to do things, you did them. Because what were you going to do? Accuse the Pope of rape. The Pope was infallible. Therefore, the Pope could not commit rape. Therefore, if something happened in his chambers, it wasn't really what you thought it was. That's the logic John was operating under, and he was learning to use it like a weapon. The worst part is that this logic made a twisted kind of sense. If the Pope was infallible, if his authority came directly from God, then whatever he did must be acceptable, must be fine, must be part of God's plan. The idea that the Pope could do something wrong was theologically impossible. His wrongness would make God's judgment wrong, and God couldn't be wrong. So the women must have done something to deserve it, or they misunderstood what was happening, or they were lying about it, or it didn't really happen the way they remembered it, or, and this was the most insidious part, if they participated in it, they had consented, and therefore there was nothing wrong with it. This is the psychological trap of absolute authority, combined with the claim of infallibility. Once those two things exist together, the authority figure becomes untouchable, not just legally untouchable, morally untouchable, because touching them morally would require admitting that the entire system is built on a lie. One woman who became particularly important to John was named Stephan. She had been his father's concubine. When Ulrich died, she transferred to John's attention. This wasn't particularly unusual for the time. Women who had belonged to a father often belonged to the son. But what John did with Stvana revealed something about how completely he was beginning to believe in his own authority. He impregnated her, left her with the evidence of what he'd done inside her body. The pregnancy would have shown everyone what had happened between her and the Pope. And then when he was finished with her, he simply moved on to the next woman. But Stephen wasn't the only one. The accounts that survive describe John bedding dozens of women, not dozens in a loose sense. Dozens specifically. The word used in the Chronicles is innumerable. When medieval chroniclers used that word, it meant they gave up counting. They stopped trying to document each individual victim because there were too many. There were so many that you couldn't keep track of them all. Some of these women were pilgrims. They had come to Rome from dozens of miles away, from other cities, from other countries. They had saved money. They had prayed. They had made the journey because they wanted to see the Holy Father. And they'd been taught that this would be a spiritual experience that would change their lives forever. And it did change their lives forever, just not in the way they'd hoped. They were locked in rooms in the palace, raped repeatedly, then released, traumatized, and shamed to somehow make their way home. They would carry this experience forever. They would never speak about it because who would believe them? The Pope was infallible. If they claimed he'd raped them, they were claiming something impossible. They would be destroyed as liars. Their families would be destroyed as spreaders of vile accusations against the Holy Father. So, they kept silent, which meant the rapes continued, which meant more women were victimized, which meant the pattern perpetuated itself. But here's where it gets darker than anything that had happened before. John also used his power on his own family. According to the testimony that was eventually compiled at the Synod of Rome in 963, the official church council where his crimes were finally formally documented, John had sexual relations with his own sisters, both of them. Sisters who shared his blood, who had been raised in the same palace, who had grown up watching their father abuse his power, and their mother manipulated. And not just his sisters, he also had sexual relations with his niece, his own blood relative, a girl from his family. The accounts don't specify her age, but given that John was engaging in predatory behavior with the young women of Rome, it's reasonable to assume she was young. These weren't rumors whispered by enemies. These weren't accusations made by people with an axe to grind against the papal family. These were testimonies given by eyewitnesses in an official ecclesiastical proceeding. These were people with direct knowledge of what they were describing. Cardinal Raphael, a high-ranking official of the papal court, someone who worked in the palace, someone who saw things firsthand, stood before an assembly of bishops and testified that he had personally witnessed John in bed with Sphana, his father's concubine. Raphael didn't testify reluctantly. He didn't appear pressured. He simply stated what he had seen, as if describing something that was common knowledge, because it was common knowledge. Everyone in the palace knew. Everyone in the upper echelons of the church knew. This wasn't a secret being kept by a few conspirators. This was an open scandal that everyone knew about, and everyone was pretending didn't exist. The incest created a theological crisis that the church was entirely unprepared to handle. Incest was a mortal sin, one of the gravest. It violated not just Christian law, but natural law as understood by medieval theology. It was seen as a corruption at the deepest level, a violation of the most fundamental bonds. Kings had been deposed for less. Men had been executed for incest. But the man committing it was supposedly infallible. He was the Pope. He was God's representative on earth. He couldn't be wrong about anything. So here was the contradiction. Either the Pope was infallible, in which case his incest must somehow be acceptable, which it obviously wasn't by any logical standard, or the Pope wasn't actually infallible, in which case the entire theological foundation of the Catholic Church was a lie. It was an impossible choice. So, the Church simply refused to choose. They didn't formally acknowledge it. They didn't attempt to reconcile it with doctrine. They pretended it wasn't happening, even as John continued to do it. The nuns became a particular obsession of his. There were convicts attached to the palace, women who had taken religious vows, women who had devoted their sexuality to God, women who belonged to no man. John decided that his authority as Pope superseded their vows, so he used them repeatedly, forcing them into sexual contact, making it clear that their vows meant nothing when the Pope decided otherwise. If you were a nun in Rome in those years and John wanted you, guards would come to your convent. You would be brought to his chambers. You would be raped. Then you would be sent back, and everyone around you would know what had happened. But no one would say anything because the Pope was infallible. Therefore, what had happened couldn't actually be what you thought it was. The psychological damage of this was immense. A nun's entire identity was wrapped up in her vows, in her dedication to God, in her refusal of carnal relations. John violated all of that. He violated not just her body, but the very foundation of her spiritual identity. By 960, John was also taking male lovers. The accounts describe him holding gay orgies at the Vatican palace. The language is awkward. This is medieval chroniclers trying to describe something they found disturbing and weren't quite sure how to categorize. But what they're describing is clear. John was coercing sexual encounters with men as well as women. He was using his absolute power to gain sexual access to anyone he wanted, regardless of gender. This wasn't about desire in any normal sense. This was about demonstrating that his authority extended everywhere, that no one was safe from him, that his power was absolute and could be deployed for anything he wanted. The palace itself had become something unrecognizable. The Lateran Palace, where supposedly holy popes had lived in prayer and contemplation, had been transformed into something that Lutheran described as a warehouse and a den of vice. Women were being held prisoner there. Sexual violence was happening constantly. It had become a place of systematic horror, and John was the architect of all of it. But here's the thing nobody talks about. By around 960, something in John's psychology started to shift. The servants noticed it first. His energy changed. The frantic predation seemed to slow down. He started spending hours in the library again, but this time it was different. He was reading theological texts. He was pulling down manuscripts and studying them with the intensity of someone looking for answers to questions that were tearing him apart. What had he discovered? What could possibly shake a man who had just spent years raping women with complete impunity? The historians who study this period have theories. One suggestion is that John had begun to realize something fundamental. It's 955, Rome, 300 in the morning. The bells of the Lateran Palace are silent. The city beyond the walls is asleep. But inside those consecrated halls, something is screaming. Not a scream you can hear with your ears. A scream inside the mind of a man barely old enough to grow facial hair, who is supposed to be God's representative on earth. His name is John. He's 18 years old. He is the Pope. Right now, in this moment, he is standing in a marble corridor that stretches into darkness, candles flickering along the walls, and he's staring at his own hands like they belong to someone else. Because they do. They belong to someone else now. Someone he doesn't recognize. Someone who has done things in the past 6 months that should be impossible for a human being to do and still live with themselves. The corridor is cold, stone underneath his feet. His white robes, the robes that mark him as infallible, as God's voice on earth, they sweep across the floor as he walks. He hasn't slept. Not really. Not since the dreams started. Dreams where he's standing in front of God and God is asking him to explain what he's done. And John can't speak, can't form words, can't defend himself, because there is no defense for what he knows he is. But John is learning that the human mind is remarkably good at compartmentalization. You can do unspeakable things during the day and tell yourself it isn't really happening. You can wear white robes and speak blessings and perform ceremonies, and then when the sun sets become something else entirely, something that even you don't want to name. You can perform Mass for thousands of people, and in those moments you can almost believe you're holy. You can speak the words of Christ, and in the speaking of them, you can pretend that you believe them. You can look into the faces of the faithful and see their absolute certainty that you are God's representative on earth. And you can almost convince yourself that they're right, that you're not a monster, that what's been happening in the palace isn't really happening. But then the sun goes down and the women start arriving. The women started coming almost immediately after his election, within days, like the universe itself was testing him, seeing how quickly it could corrupt the young pope. If you enjoy dark history like this, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I want to know which parts of the world are hearing these stories that the Catholic Church spent centuries trying to bury. Because what happened to John, what he did, what was done to him, what the institution sacrificed to hide it, that's the kind of truth they don't want you to know. Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand John, you have to understand the machine that created him. The system, the family, the absolute corruption that made a teenage boy pope. John's father was Albertrich II. Not a king, not a noble in any legitimate sense, a warlord, a man who ruled Rome. The way you rule something you've conquered in battle through sheer force of will, and the absolute certainty that anyone who opposed him would be destroyed. Ulrich understood power in its purest form. He understood that you control people through fear, through dominance, through the knowledge that you can do anything to them, and face no consequences. His mother was Marozia. If Ulrich was the instrument of violence, Marozia was the architect of its perpetuation. She was a woman whose reputation was so scandalous that even in an era accustomed to scandal, an era where popes had mistresses and cardinals had bastard children, and the church itself was a political game played by the powerful, people still whispered about her. They called her a seductress. They called her a manipulator. They called her worse. Marozia had borne children to multiple men. She had orchestrated the election of popes. She had poisoned enemies. She had built alliances through her sexuality and destroyed them through her cunning. By the time John was born, she was already a legend, a woman who understood that in a world where men held all the official power, the most dangerous woman was one who could use that power while remaining officially invisible. When Ulrich died in 954, something that had seemed impossible became suddenly urgently real. He left behind a teenage son, a boy barely old enough to be considered a man. And Marozia, that brilliant, ruthless woman, she understood immediately what had to be done. Her son needed to become pope, not through years of study, not through spiritual preparation, not through any of the traditional paths that might lead to the papacy. John needed to become pope quickly, while his mother still lived, while she could guide him, while she could use him to consolidate the family's power. Marozia understood something fundamental about the world she lived in. The pope wasn't just a spiritual leader. Saying that was like saying the sun was just a light source. The pope controlled Rome, commanded armies, issued laws, controlled the church's vast wealth, appointed bishops who answered to him across all of Christendom. He could start wars. He could end wars. He could declare anyone a heretic and have them burned. And most crucially, he couldn't be questioned because everyone, literally everyone in that world, had been taught since birth that the Pope was infallible, that his word was God's word, that opposing him was opposing God himself, that if you disagreed with the Pope, you were disagreeing with the voice of God on earth. That's the kind of power Marozia wanted for her son, so she arranged for it. At 16, John was made a cardinal by Pope Agapitus Cyprian. It was a ceremonial appointment, really just marking him as a potential future pope. Just letting it be known that this boy, this teenager had the backing of the most powerful family in Rome. Just beginning the process that would culminate in his election at 18 in 955, John was elected pope. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means. An 18-year-old boy barely out of adolescence, barely shaving, suddenly given absolute power over the spiritual lives of millions of people. Given control of vast wealth, given command of armies, given the authority to declare himself infallible, given the assurance that nothing he did could be questioned because he spoke for God. The cardinals who voted for him weren't choosing a spiritual leader. They weren't even pretending to. They were choosing someone young enough to be controlled, young enough to be manipulated, young enough to do whatever his family told him to do. They were choosing someone connected enough through his family to protect their interests. And most crucially, they were choosing someone who would do whatever they wanted without the kind of moral objections that older, more experienced men might raise. Someone still young enough that he might not have developed a fully formed conscience. Someone still malleable. They got exactly what they wanted, just not in the way they expected. The first few months, John tried. He performed the ceremonies. He crowned kings. He signed documents. The cardinals who had elected him probably thought everything was going perfectly. The teenage pope was compliant, malleable, following instructions. Then the servant started noticing things. He would wander the palace at night, not sleeping, just walking through the corridors, like he was looking for something he couldn't find. His eyes were strange, like someone who had seen something that couldn't be unseen. The people close to him, the guards, the attendants, they noticed he'd stopped eating regular meals. His entire worldview was a lie. He had been taught his entire life that he was infallible, that he spoke for God, that his authority came from heaven. But if that was true, then everything he was doing should be fine, should be acceptable, should be part of God's plan. And yet something inside him, some part of his conscience that hadn't been completely destroyed by absolute power, was screaming that this wasn't right, that he wasn't infallible, that he was just a teenager who had been given godlike power and was using it to destroy people. That contradiction became unbearable. The change became more obvious around 961 and 962. John's behavior became erratic. One moment he would be the same brazen predator committing crimes in plain sight. The next moment he would withdraw completely. He'd lock himself away. He'd stop eating. He'd experience what we might now call panic attacks. Moments where his heart would race so fast he thought it would explode. Where he couldn't catch his breath, where something inside him seemed to be tearing apart. The servants would find him sitting in the dark, not speaking, staring at nothing. They'd see him pacing the corridors at 3 hours a.m., muttering to himself. Some accounts suggest he was having what might be described as religious visions. Though whether these were genuine spiritual experiences or a mind fragmenting under the weight of what it had done is impossible to know. The cardinals who had elected him started to get nervous. This wasn't the compliant puppet they'd chosen. This was someone whose mind was breaking, and a broken pope was dangerous. A pope experiencing a crisis of conscience might do anything. He might confess. He might expose what was happening. He might destabilize the entire institution. Something had to be done. In 960, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto arrived in Rome. Otto was powerful. Otto had armies. Otto was not the kind of person who could be intimidated by the Pope's supposed infallibility. And apparently Otto was horrified by what was happening in the papal palace. The emperor was accustomed to brutal realpolitik, to the ruthlessness that power required. But even he seemed to find the systematic sexual predation in the most sacred building in Christendom intolerable. Otto began pressuring John to resign. The Pope tried to resist. How could he resign? The Pope was the Pope. It wasn't a position you could just step down from. Your authority came from God. It wasn't something you could put down like a crown. But Otto had armies, and Otto didn't really care about theological principles. Otto wanted the problem solved. So Otto kept pushing. And John, whose mind was already fragmenting, found himself facing the one thing his absolute authority couldn't protect him from: the will of a more powerful man backed by military force. In 963, they called a Synod, a formal church council. The Synod was ostensibly about addressing various ecclesiastical issues, but everyone knew what it was really about. It was about creating an official record of John's crimes. It was about documenting what had been happening in the palace. It was about creating the evidence they would need to force him out. The testimonies came. Bishop after bishop, cardinal after cardinal stood up and described what they had witnessed, or what they had heard from others who had witnessed it. The accounts of rape, the descriptions of women being held prisoner, the testimony from Cardinal Raphael about seeing John in bed with his father's concubine. The details about the nuns who had been violated, the mentions of male lovers and gay orgies. It was all documented. Everything, every crime, every victim. All of it recorded in the official proceedings of the Synod. And then something remarkable happened. The Church didn't publicize any of it. The Synod created an official record of papal crimes that was as complete as any document could be. And then the Church sealed it away, locked it in the archives, made sure that ordinary Catholics would never know what had been documented, made sure that John's victims would be erased from history. Because if the faithful knew what the Pope had done, if they knew that the representative of God on earth had been systematically raping women, the entire foundation of the Church would crumble. People might start asking questions. People might start doubting, and doubt is the thing institutions fear most. John, confronted with the Synod's documentation of his crimes, was given a choice. He could resign, or he could be removed. The cardinals weren't going to go through the public humiliation of deposing a pope. It was theologically complicated. It created too many awkward questions. But resignation, that was clean. That was simple. He could resign and then retire to a monastery to contemplate his sins. The faithful could be told he had chosen a life of prayer. Crisis averted. In 963, John stepped down. He was 26 years old. The official story was that he had decided to pursue spiritual contemplation, that he wanted to live a monastic life, that he was choosing voluntary simplicity and prayer. The reality, known only to the cardinals and bishops who had forced him out, was that he was fleeing from crimes that were about to catch up with him. The women he had raped received nothing. No apology, no acknowledgement, no recompense. They simply disappeared from history. Their suffering was deemed an inconvenient truth that the Church needed to erase. What happened to John after he abdicated is mostly lost to history. Some accounts say he retreated to a monastery. Others suggest he was kept under guard, prevented from talking to anyone who might hear his story. One particularly lurid account claims that Ottavesta, tired of waiting for ecclesiastical processes to conclude, simply had the young man killed to prevent him from ever becoming a problem again. What we know for certain is that John died in 964. He was 27 years old. His death was barely noted. A brief entry somewhere in the palace records, a passing reference that someone had died. Then silence. The Church sealed his tomb. They removed his name from the official list of popes. They declared his entire papacy invalid. They attempted as thoroughly as possible to erase him from history. He became a ghost pope, a pope who wasn't allowed to have existed. For centuries, his existence was known only to historians who had access to the sealed archives. The Protestant Reformation would later use him as ammunition against papal authority, proof that even the supposed representative of God on earth could be a monster. But the Church simply denied it. They pretended he had never existed. They rewrote history to eliminate the inconvenient fact of his presence. The testimonies survived anyway. Lutran's chronicle survived. The Synod of Rome's documentation, though suppressed, survived. Fragments of the truth remained, scattered across medieval documents, waiting for historians brave enough to piece them together. And when historians finally did piece them together in the 20th century, when the Church's ability to suppress uncomfortable truths had weakened, what emerged was a portrait of systematic sexual predation so complete, so documented, so undeniable that even the Church couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. They just wished people would forget about it. The real scandal of Pope John the Thorn isn't that he was a sexual predator. History has examples of that. Kings and popes and powerful men have committed sexual violence since the beginning of civilization. What makes John's story different is what happened next. What makes it matter is how the institution responded. The Church knew. The cardinals knew. The bishops knew. The Pope's own staff knew. Eyewitnesses had seen the crimes. Victims had come forward. Evidence was documented. And the institution chose to protect him. Anyway, they created a conspiracy of silence. Not a formal one, but an implicit understanding that this problem would be handled internally, quietly, in a way that wouldn't damage the church's credibility. The victims were abandoned. The truth was suppressed. And when the Pope finally had to step down, the institution made sure that the reasons for his removal would be buried so deeply that future generations of Catholics might never know it had happened. But here's what nobody wanted to acknowledge. By around 960, something inside John was beginning to break. The servants noticed it first. His behavior started to change. The frantic, brazen predation seemed to slow. He would disappear for hours into the library, pulling down theological manuscripts, studying texts with an intensity that suggested he was wrestling with something fundamental about existence itself. What had he discovered? What could possibly shake a man who had spent years raping women with complete impunity? The historians who study this period have theories. One possibility: John had begun to realize something truly terrifying. His entire worldview was a lie. He had been taught his entire life that he was infallible, that he spoke for God, that his authority came directly from heaven, that his words could not be wrong, that his judgment was absolute, that nothing he did could be a sin because he was beyond sin, beyond judgment, beyond all human law. But if that was true, then everything he was doing should be fine, should be acceptable, should be sanctified by God himself. And yet something inside him, some fragment of conscience that hadn't been completely destroyed by absolute power, was screaming that this wasn't right, that he wasn't infallible, that he was just a teenager who had been given godlike power and was using it to destroy people. That contradiction became unbearable. By 961 and 962, his behavior became increasingly erratic. One moment he would be the same brazen predator committing crimes in plain sight, as if he didn't care who knew. The next moment he would withdraw completely. He would lock himself away. He would stop eating. He would pace the corridors at 300 a.m., muttering to himself. The servants would find him sitting in the dark, not speaking, staring at nothing. They reported that he seemed to be experiencing what we might now describe as panic attacks. Moments where his heart would race so violently he thought it would explode, where he couldn't catch his breath, where something inside him seemed to be tearing itself apart. The cardinals who had elected him started to get nervous. This wasn't the compliant puppet they had chosen. This was someone whose mind was breaking apart. And a pope experiencing a complete psychological breakdown was dangerous. A pope consumed by guilt and doubt might do anything. He might confess everything. He might expose what had been happening. He might destabilize the entire institution. Something had to be done. But what? In 960, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto the Arm arrived in Rome. Otto was powerful. Otto commanded armies. Otto was not the kind of person who could be intimidated by the Pope's supposed infallibility. And apparently, based on the historical accounts that survive, Otto was genuinely horrified by what was happening inside the papal palace. The emperor was accustomed to brutal realpolitik. He understood power. He understood that ruling an empire sometimes required doing terrible things. He had committed his own atrocities. He had ordered executions. He had waged wars. He was not a squeamish man. But even he apparently found the systematic sexual predation in the most sacred building in Crescendum intolerable. Even Otto I, with all his ruthlessness, looked at what was happening in the Lateran Palace and decided this had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Otto began pressuring John to resign. The Pope tried to resist. How could he resign? The Pope was the Pope. It wasn't a position you could just step down from. Your authority came from God. You couldn't put it down like a crown and walk away. But Otto had armies, and Otto didn't really care about theological principles. Otto wanted the problem solved. So Otto kept pushing. He made it clear that if John didn't resign voluntarily, he would be removed forcibly if necessary. And John, whose mind was already fragmenting, found himself facing the one thing his absolute authority couldn't protect him from: the will of a more powerful man backed by military force. The contradiction was too much. John's theology had taught him that his authority was absolute, but it wasn't. It was contingent. It depended on the acquiescence of secular power. It could be revoked, it could be taken away. His infallibility was revealed as contingent and political. In 963, they called a synod, a formal church council. The synod was ostensibly about addressing various ecclesiastical issues. But everyone involved knew what it was really about. It was about creating an official record of John's crimes. It was about documenting what had been happening in the palace. It was about creating the evidence they would need to force him out of office without directly admitting that they were doing so because he was a rapist and sexual predator. The testimonies came. Bishop after bishop, cardinal after cardinal stood before the assembly and described what they had witnessed, or what they had heard from reliable witnesses. The accounts of systematic rape, the descriptions of women being held prisoner in the sacred palace. The testimony from Cardinal Raphael, a high-ranking official of the papal court, describing how he had personally witnessed John in bed with his father's concubine. The details about the nuns who had been violated, the mentions of male lovers, and the orgies happening in the most sacred place in Christianity, the accusations of incest. It was all documented. Every single crime, every victim. All of it recorded in the official proceedings of the synod. A complete catalogue of papal atrocities. And then something remarkable happened. Something that reveals everything you need to know about how institutions actually work. The Church didn't publicize any of it. The synod had created an official record of papal crimes that was as complete as any medieval document could be. They had documented everything. They had compiled testimony. They had created evidence, and then they sealed it away, locked it in the archives, made sure that ordinary Catholics would never know what had been documented, made sure that John's victims would be erased from history. Because if the faithful knew what the Pope had done, if they knew that the representative of God on earth had been systematically raping women, the entire foundation of the Church would crumble. People might start asking questions about whether the Pope was actually infallible. People might start doubting whether the Pope actually spoke for God. People might start questioning the entire structure of authority that the Church depended on. And doubt is the thing institutions fear most. This is the pattern. This is how institutions that claim absolute moral authority actually behave when confronted with the crimes of those they have vested with absolute power. They protect the predator. They silence the victims. They rewrite history. They do whatever is necessary to preserve the institution's credibility because the institution's survival is more important than the welfare of the people who were victimized. Think about that. Let it sink in. The institution's survival is more important than the victims. John, confronted with the synod's documentation of his crimes, was given a choice. He could resign, or he could be removed. The cardinals weren't going to go through the public humiliation of deposing a pope. It was theologically complicated. It created too many awkward questions. If they deposed him, they would have to admit why. They would have to publicly state that the Pope was a sexual predator. They would have to admit that the infallible representative of God on earth had been committing rape. But resignation, that was clean, that was simple. That solved the problem without forcing anyone to speak the truth aloud. He could resign and then retire to a monastery to contemplate his sins. The faithful could be told he had chosen a life of prayer. The story could be that he had decided monastics. Life was his true calling. Crisis averted. The institution preserved. The victims forgotten. In 963, John stepped down. He was 26 years old. The official story given to the Catholic world was that he had decided to pursue spiritual contemplation, that he wanted to live a monastic life, that he was choosing voluntary simplicity and prayer. He was choosing to withdraw from the responsibilities of the papacy because he felt called to a simpler life of devotion. The reality known only to the cardinals and bishops who had forced him out was that he was fleeing from crimes that were about to catch up with him. He was leaving because he had been given an ultimatum: resign or be deposed, and if you're deposed, everything comes out. The women he had raped received nothing. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement, not a penny of recompense. They simply disappeared from history. Their suffering was deemed an inconvenient truth that the Church needed to erase. They were casualties of the institution's need to protect itself. What happened to John after he abdicated is mostly lost to history. Some accounts say he retreated to a monastery and lived out his years in prayer and contemplation. Others suggest he was kept under close guard, prevented from talking to anyone who might hear his story. He was isolated, silenced, erased. One particularly lurid account claims that Otto the Fun, tired of waiting for ecclesiastical processes to conclude, tired of the risk that John might somehow reclaim power or expose what had happened, simply had the young man killed. That Otto decided the cleanest solution was to eliminate the problem entirely. That John V was murdered to prevent him from ever becoming a problem again. What we know for certain is that John died in 964. He was 27 years old. His death was barely noted. A brief entry somewhere in the palace records. Maybe a passing reference that someone had died. Then silence. Nothing else. No obituary. No official acknowledgement. No ceremony. The Church sealed his tomb. They removed his name from the official list of popes. They declared his entire papacy invalid. They went through historical records and attempted as thoroughly as possible to erase him from history. They created a gap, an absence, a space where a pope used to be, but wasn't supposed to have been there. He became a ghost pope, a pope who wasn't allowed to have existed. For centuries, his existence was known only to historians who had access to the sealed archives. Only people with special permission could read the Synod of Rome's documentation of his crimes. Only scholars who dug deeply into medieval records could piece together what had happened. The Protestant Reformation would later use Pope John V's ammunition against papal authority. The Protestants pointed to him and said, "Here is your proof that the Pope is not infallible. Here is your proof that the Pope is not automatically speaking for God. Here is your proof that the Pope is just a man prone to the same sins and depravities as any other man. Here is the Pope who turned the Lateran Palace into a brothel." The Church responded to these attacks, not by acknowledging that the accusations were true, but by simply denying that John DeWine existed at all. They didn't defend him. They didn't argue that he had been slandered. They simply said, "This person you're talking about, we don't know who that is. Our records show no such pope. Your claims are based on lies and historical inaccuracy." They rewrote history. They eliminated him. They created a narrative in which he had never been there, but the accounts survived anyway. Luton's Chronicle survived. The Synod of Rome's documentation, though suppressed, survived in fragments scattered across medieval documents, preserved in archives that the Church couldn't completely control. The evidence remained. The truth refused to stay buried. It took historians in the 20th century, when the Church's absolute power had weakened, and when scholars could access previously closed archives, to piece together what had actually happened. It took decades of careful research to recover the truth from the fragments. And when historians finally did piece it all together, when they presented the complete picture of papal predation and institutional cover-up, what emerged was something undeniable. The most powerful religious institution in the Western world had knowingly protected a sexual predator. They had documented his crimes. They had hidden the documentation. They had erased the victims. And then they had attempted to erase the perpetrator from history itself. The real scandal of Pope John isn't that he was a sexual predator. History has many examples of that. Kings and popes and powerful men have committed sexual violence since the beginning of time. Predators exist. Power attracts them. This is not a surprise. What makes John's story different is what happened next. What makes it matter is how the institution responded when confronted with incontrovertible evidence of systematic rape happening in their most sacred space. The Church knew, the cardinals knew, the bishops knew, the Pope's own staff knew. Eyewitnesses had seen the crimes with their own eyes. Victims had come forward, evidence was documented in official church proceedings, and the institution chose to protect him anyway. They created a conspiracy of silence, not a formal one with meetings and documents and agreed-upon strategies, but an implicit understanding, a mutual agreement among the men in power that this problem would be handled internally, quietly, in a way that wouldn't damage the Church's credibility. The victims were abandoned. The truth was suppressed. And when the Pope finally had to step down, the institution made sure that the reasons for his removal would be buried so deeply that future generations of Catholics might never know it had happened. This is the pattern that repeats in every institution that claims absolute moral authority while being accountable to no one. When you look at institutions today, churches, corporations, governments, universities, hospitals that appear to be protecting powerful individuals from accountability for sexual crimes, you're seeing this same pattern replay. You're seeing the same priorities asserting themselves. You're seeing the same institutional calculations. You're seeing the same attempt to erase evidence, silence survivors, and protect the predator. Jonathan died 1,000 years ago. But the machinery he exemplified, the system that protected him and erased his victims, that machinery is still running. It's still destroying people. It's still protecting predators. It's still demanding that we forget. It's still asking victims to stay silent so that institutions can preserve their credibility. The Pope who raped nuns, the Pope who held women prisoner, the Pope who committed incest, the Pope whose predation was so complete and so systematic that it commanded the attention and horror of bishops across all of Christendom. That Pope lived and died 1,000 years ago. But his methods survived, his logic survived, his justification survived. And right now, today, in this moment, those same methods are being used against vulnerable people in institutions all around you. Thank you for listening to this. Your comment means everything. Tell me what you think about this story. Tell me how an institution that claims to represent God can systematically protect someone committing rape. Tell me whether you believe institutions actually change, or whether we're just seeing the same cycles of predation and cover-up repeat over and over again. Subscribe if you want more stories that institutions would prefer to keep buried. Because the victims deserve to be remembered. Their suffering deserves to be known, and history deserves to tell the truth even when that truth implicates the most powerful people in the world. Where are you listening from? I want to know that this truth is reaching beyond these walls. That people everywhere are learning what their institutions tried to hide. That's what changes things. Not forgetting, not moving on, but refusing to let the past disappear into silence. Understanding Pope John IV isn't an exercise in condemning the past. It's not about congratulating ourselves on how far we've come. It's not about feeling morally superior to medieval people who, after all, lived in a different time with different values. This is about recognizing patterns. This is about understanding how power works. This is about seeing the machinery that was built in those medieval palaces and recognizing that same machinery operating today in institutions all around you. The specific techniques used to break Jay's victims, the isolation, the surveillance, the constant criticism, the manipulation. These techniques didn't die in 963. They didn't become historical curiosities locked away with the rest of medieval history. They survived. They spread. They were refined and perfected. They are currently being used to control and destroy people in abusive relationships. They're being used by cults to break down recruits and install absolute obedience. They're being used by authoritarian governments to control their own populations. They're being used by certain corporations to maintain power over workers. They're being used anywhere that power wants to be absolute and unchecked. The knowledge that John's victims possessed, that the human mind can be systematically broken through psychological manipulation without leaving physical marks. That knowledge escaped the palace. It spread across the centuries. It multiplied. It became a blueprint for control that continues to be used against vulnerable people every single day. Think about the structure that allowed Jay's crimes. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It was built on specific principles. a hierarchical structure where one person had absolute power over everyone else, a theological framework that made that person immune to criticism or accountability, an institutional mechanism that prioritized the institution's survival over the protection of victims, a collective agreement among those in power that maintaining the system was more important than telling the truth. Sound familiar? Because this structure isn't unique to 10th century Rome. This structure exists wherever authority is absolute and accountability is absent. The abuse happened not because John was uniquely evil, though he may have been. It happened because the structure created the conditions for abuse. It happened because the system was designed in such a way that nothing could stop him. It happened because when abuse occurred, the institution's first instinct was always self-preservation. What makes the Codger Bride preparation story and the John Doyne story so crucial to understand is that they reveal the same principle operating at different scales. Both show what happens when you have absolute power combined with absolute immunity from consequences. Both show what institutions will do to protect themselves. Both show how victims are erased to preserve the reputation of the powerful. Here's what makes this history uncomfortable. The institution that protected John is still here. The Catholic Church still exists. It's still one of the most powerful institutions on earth. It's still claiming moral authority. It's still telling people how to live their lives and what to believe. And it was protecting a sexual predator 1,000 years ago. It was systematically erasing victims. It was choosing institutional survival over truth. Have things changed? Has the Church reformed? Yes. In some ways, there are survivor advocates. There are people within the institution trying to address these issues. There are movements toward transparency and accountability. But the fundamental structure remains the same. A hierarchical organization where power flows downward and accountability flows nowhere. Where the people at the top have extraordinary authority combined with extraordinary immunity from consequences. Where the institution's reputation is more important than the protection of vulnerable people. Is this unique to the Catholic Church? No. This is the structure of most large institutions. Governments have it, corporations have it, universities have it, military organizations have it. The pattern is everywhere. And wherever the pattern exists, abuse follows. Because power without accountability inevitably produces abuse. Because institutions that prioritize their own survival inevitably protect predators. Because systems designed to concentrate authority inevitably become tools of exploitation. What makes the John the F story particularly important is this: the knowledge of how to systematically break a person's will without leaving marks. That knowledge escaped the palace. It didn't stay locked in medieval Rome. It traveled. It was studied. It was refined. Intelligence agencies learned it and used it in interrogations. Cults learned it and used it on recruits. Psychologists studied it and documented it. Abusers learned it and applied it in intimate relationships. The understanding that you can destroy someone's autonomy purely through psychological means, without physical violence, without leaving evidence. That knowledge is still being actively used to harm people today. Every time someone in a relationship uses control, isolation, constant criticism, and unpredictability to break their partner's will, they're using techniques developed and perfected in places like the Lateran Palace. Every time a cult breaks down a recruit through sleep deprivation and psychological manipulation, they're using techniques refined through centuries of institutional practice. Every time a government uses psychological torture in interrogations, they're applying knowledge that was accumulated through the systematic abuse of vulnerable people. The machinery built to break John's victims is still operating. It's been improved. It's been systematized. It's been studied and refined by people with PhDs and academic positions. But fundamentally, it's the same machinery, and understanding that machinery is the first step toward resisting it. Here's what haunts me about this story. We don't know the names of most of Jay's victims. We know Stefana. We know there were nuns. We know there were pilgrims. We know there were daughters of noble families and servants and women kidnapped from the streets. But their names are gone. Their stories are erased. Their voices have been silenced for 1,000 years. History recorded John's crimes, but not their humanity. History documented the predation, but not the victim's resilience. History preserved the mechanism of abuse, but forgot the people being abused. This is what institutional erasure looks like. It's not just that uncomfortable truths are hidden. It's that entire human beings are removed from the historical record. Their suffering doesn't matter enough to preserve their names. Their identities are deemed irrelevant. They become statistics. Countless women, numerous victims, an indeterminate number of rapes. The institution that erased them is still here. It's still making decisions about what matters and what doesn't. It's still choosing what to preserve and what to forget. It's still deciding whose stories are worth telling and whose suffering is deemed irrelevant. The most disturbing aspect of understanding John Padinthea's crimes is recognizing that they weren't unique to his time or place. The machinery he exemplified, the systematic use of power to harm others, combined with the institutional apparatus designed to protect the perpetrator,